J.D. Vance just said the quiet part out loud about Netanyahu. And it's not what you think. I spent the morning going back through exactly what he said. And the more I read, the clearer it got that this was a warning. Before we get into it, I'm curious where you land on this one. Drop a comment and tell me what you make of it. Because honestly, I've been going back and forth myself. So there was a moment yesterday in Washington that almost nobody treated like a bomb going off. And I'm not sure if that's because people are tired or because the news cycle is moving too fast. Or maybe because we've all gotten a little numb to the words vice president and Israel in the same sentence. But I'm going to walk you through it anyway, because what Vance actually said, the wording he used, it matters. Let me back up. The vice president sat down for an interview. Fairly routine stuff. You've seen a million of these. Somebody asks a question about foreign policy. The official gives a polished answer that sounds like it was drafted by 7 different people and focus grouped for 2 weeks. That's how it usually goes. That's the machine. But this time, Vance stepped off the script in a way that's getting missed. He was asked about Israel, about Netanyahu specifically. And instead of the usual boilerplate, ironclad commitment, unshakable alliance, all the phrases they repeat until they lose all meaning, he acknowledged disagreements. Now wait. That doesn't sound explosive on its face, right? Allies disagree. Friends argue. Couples fight about where to eat dinner. It's normal. But here's the thing. American vice presidents do not do this. They don't. Not publicly. Not when it comes to Israel. There's an unwritten rule, and it has been followed by every administration for decades. You present a unified front. You keep the disagreements in the room. You never let the other side see any daylight between you. That's the playbook. Vance just tore a page out of that playbook and threw it on the floor. And I keep going back to the phrase he used. He said he has disagreements on some issues. That's the quote. On some issues. That's broad. That's unspecific. That's the kind of language diplomats use when they're not talking about trade tariffs or agricultural subsidies. That's the language they use when the disagreements are deep enough that they can't even say what they are. So what are they? Nobody in the mainstream press is asking that yet. They're too busy playing the quote on a loop, treating it like just another soundbite. But if you actually think about it, if you sit with it for a minute, the implications are huge. Think about the relationship between the United States and Israel. It's not just an alliance. It's woven into the fabric of American foreign policy, and it's been that way for generations. It's a relationship built on mutual interest, sure, but also on something deeper, a sense of shared values, shared history, shared strategic necessity. That's why presidents and prime ministers have, for the most part, kept their disagreements behind closed doors. Even when they hated each other, even when they fundamentally disagreed on the direction of the region. They smiled for the cameras, said all the right things, and then fought like hell in private. But Vance broke that pattern. And I think he did it on purpose. Because here's what I keep coming back to. He didn't just say, we disagree sometimes. He said, my duty is to protect American interests. He said, when we have differences, we discuss them honestly. Now read that again. My duty is to protect American interests. That's not a throwaway line. That's a positioning statement. That's him telling the American public and telling Netanyahu directly that the United States will prioritize itself. That sounds obvious, but in the history of this alliance, that hasn't always been the operating assumption. For a long time, the assumption has been that American and Israeli interests are so closely aligned that prioritizing one is the same as prioritizing the other. Vance is quietly contesting that assumption. Think about what that means. He's the second most powerful person in the country. He's the heir apparent to the presidency, depending on who you ask. And he's out there on the record saying that there are issues where the United States and Israel don't see eye to eye. And not only that, but when they don't see eye to eye, he's going to push for what's best for America. That's not diplomacy. That's a prelude to something. Let me take you back a few months, because this didn't come out of nowhere. There's been a quiet strain in the relationship for a while now. It started with the settlements, actually. The Israeli government kept approving new housing in the West Bank, and the Biden administration, and then the current administration, kept asking them to stop. And they didn't stop. They kept building. And the Americans kept asking, and the Israelis kept building. And eventually, the Americans stopped asking so loudly because they didn't want to create a public rupture. But the frustration was there. It was building. You could see it in the memos that got leaked. You could see it in the private conversations that occasionally made their way to reporters. You could see it in the way the State Department started talking about the Palestinians with a little more sympathy than they used to. Nothing overt, nothing that would trigger a headline, just a shift, a slow, grinding shift in the tectonic plates of the alliance. And now Vance has confirmed it. He's essentially admitted that the shift is real, that it's not just bureaucratic frustration, it's policy-level disagreement. But here's the part that really gets me. He was careful. He was so careful. He said Israel is a reliable partner and ally. He said we value the relationship. He said all the things you're supposed to say. That's why nobody is sounding the alarms. Because if you just skim the quote, if you just read the first sentence, it sounds totally normal. It sounds like every other vice presidential statement on Israel going back to Walter Mondale. But then he slid in the knife. But when we have differences, we discuss them honestly. Honestly. That's the word. Not privately, not behind closed doors, honestly. That's a public commitment. That's a promise to the American people that he's going to tell them when there's a disagreement. And that's new. That is a fundamental change in how this relationship is going to function going forward. And I got to be honest with you, the Israeli government is not used to this. Netanyahu especially. He's been dealing with American presidents for decades. He's used to American leaders who play by the old rules. He's used to private disagreements and public unity. He's used to knowing that at the end of the day, the United States will have Israel's back, no matter what. But what if that's not the case anymore? What if this administration is actually going to make good on the rhetoric about protecting American interests first? What if the disagreements that Vance alluded to are the kind that can't be resolved with a phone call and a handshake? And what if Netanyahu pushed too far? I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm not in the room. I'm not privy to the intelligence briefings. I'm just a person reading the same quotes you are, trying to put the pieces together. But the pattern is there. It's visible. And if you look at the timeline, it starts to make a kind of sense. You've got the ongoing situation in Gaza, which has been a source of tension between the U.S. and Israel for months. You've got the Iranian nuclear program, where the Israeli and American timelines don't perfectly align. You've got the normalization talks with Saudi Arabia, which have hit a wall. You've got the political situation inside Israel itself, which is volatile and unpredictable and has made Netanyahu more dependent on his far-right coalition partners. And all of that is happening against the backdrop of an American election where foreign policy is becoming a wedge issue again. So when Vance says we have disagreements on some issues, he's not talking about minor bureaucratic squabbles. He's talking about the major strategic questions of the region. And he's talking about them in a way that suggests the United States is ready to draw a line. Now let me pause there for a second and just acknowledge how heavy that is, because the Israeli-American relationship is not just a political issue. For a lot of Americans, it's personal, it's religious, it's identity. And when you have the Vice President of the United States essentially saying, we're not always going to agree, and I'm okay with that being public, there's going to be a reaction. There's going to be pushback. There's going to be a very loud, very organized constituency that feels like he went too far. And I think he knew that. I think he knew exactly what he was doing, because he didn't just say it once and walk it back. He said it, and then he let the quote stand. He let it exist in the world. He didn't put out a clarifying statement an hour later. He didn't have a staffer leak an explanation to a friendly reporter. He just left it there. That's a choice. And the choice suggests that he wanted people to hear it. He wanted the message to get out. He wanted Netanyahu to understand that the rules have changed. Now the question is he speaking for the administration, or is he speaking for himself? Because that's the other piece of this that nobody's really talking about. The relationship between the vice president and the president is always complicated. Always. And sometimes the vice president says things that the president wouldn't necessarily say, either as a trial balloon or as a way to shift the Overton window, or just because they genuinely disagree. There's a long history of Veeps going rogue. But I don't think that's what happened here. I think Vance was carrying a message. I think he was delivering a signal that the administration has decided it's time to change the terms of the debate. And I think the reason he did it this way, through an interview that most people would skim past, is because he wanted to test the waters. He wanted to see what the reaction would be. He wanted to see if Netanyahu would push back publicly, or if he would absorb the hit and move on. So far, Netanyahu has been quiet. That's interesting in itself. The Israeli Prime Minister is not a quiet man. He loves a fight. He loves a public confrontation. He loves to paint himself as the defender of the Jewish people against a hostile world. And yet, when the American vice president publicly acknowledges disagreements, Netanyahu is staying silent. That's telling. Maybe he's waiting to see how the political winds blow. Maybe he's trying to figure out whether this is a one-off comment or a new policy direction. Maybe he's got his own problems, like the coalition that's constantly threatening to collapse, and he doesn't want to add a fight with the United States to the pile. But silence from Netanyahu is never a sign of weakness. It's a sign of calculation. He's figuring out his next move. And that's what makes this whole thing so tense. Because you've got two leaders, both of them strong-willed, both of them operating under intense pressure from their own constituencies, and they're now publicly acknowledging that they don't see eye to eye. The old system of private disagreement and public unity is breaking down. And once that breaks down, it's very hard to put it back together. So let's talk about what happens next, because the reactions are already starting to surface. You've got the pro-Israel lobbying groups in Washington. They're in damage control mode. They're trying to downplay what Vance said. They're trying to frame it as normal, routine, no big deal. They're telling their members that there's nothing to see here, that the relationship remains strong, that the vice president was just being honest in a way that doesn't mean anything. But they're scared. You can hear it in their statements. The language is too defensive. They're not saying this is fine and leaving it there. They're saying this is fine, nothing to worry about. Trust us, the alliance is unshakable. When you start adding extra descriptors to something that's supposedly self-evident, that's when you know there's a problem. And then you've got the other side. You've got the critics of the Israeli government, the progressives who have been calling for more distance between the U.S. and Israel for years. They're celebrating. They're treating Vance's comments like a victory. They're saying this is the beginning of the end of the blank check. And honestly, some of them are probably right. Because once you admit that there are disagreements, you open the door to the question, okay, so what are you going to do about them? Are you going to use leverage? Are you going to condition aid? Are you going to start voting differently at the UN? The admission creates pressure to act, and that's the last thing Netanyahu wants. But here's the part that really worries me, and I'm going to say this as plainly as I can. When you take a relationship that has been built on a certain set of assumptions, and you suddenly change those assumptions, you create instability. You create uncertainty. And in the Middle East, uncertainty is dangerous. It creates vacuums. It creates miscalculations. It creates opportunities for bad actors to exploit the confusion. If Israel starts to feel like the American security guarantee isn't as ironclad as it used to be, What do they do? Do they take more risks? Do they act more aggressively? Do they launch preemptive strikes that they wouldn't have launched before? Or do they retreat? Do they become more cautious? Do they seek closer ties with other powers like Russia or China to hedge against a less reliable America? These are not academic questions. These are questions that are being asked right now in Tel Aviv. They're being asked in the Mossad headquarters. They're being asked in Netanyahu's office. And the answers are going to shape the next decade of conflict in the region. And what about the Palestinians? Because they're the ones who are going to get squeezed in all of this. They always do. If the U.S. and Israel are in a public feud, the Palestinian leadership is going to try to exploit it. They're going to try to get more concessions. They're going to try to push for statehood recognition at the UN. And that's going to make Netanyahu dig in harder, because he's not going to give ground when he's under pressure from the Americans. It's a cycle, a bad cycle. And Vance's comments just made it a little bit tighter. Now, I want to zoom out for a second, because this isn't just about Israel and the United States. This is about a broader pattern that's been playing out for the last few years. And it's a pattern that should concern every single American watching this. The United States is pulling back from its historic role as the global policeman. Not completely, not all at once, but gradually, steadily, consistently. We're less willing to intervene, less willing to project power, less willing to use our influence to shape events. And this was happening regardless of who was in the White House. It's a bipartisan shift. The American public is tired of endless wars. They're tired of being the world's referee. They want to focus on home. And that shift creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, regional powers are going to assert themselves. They're going to fill the space that America leaves behind. And when they do, they're going to clash with each other. They're going to test each other's limits, and the chances of a major conflict go up. Vance's comments are a symptom of that shift. He's not just talking about Israel. He's talking about the whole approach. Protect American interests. Be honest about disagreements. Don't pretend that the old rules still apply. That's the new doctrine, and it's going to have consequences. I think that's why the mainstream media is missing the story here. They're so focused on the horse race, on the election, on the domestic back and forth, that they can't see the forest for the trees. They're treating this as a tiny blip, a minor diplomatic awkwardness. And I'm telling you, it's not. It's a signal. It's a change. And changes like this tend to accelerate. So let me ask you a question, and I want you to think about it. I'm not asking for a show of hands. I'm just asking you to turn it over in your own mind. If you were the Israeli Prime Minister and you heard the American Vice President say that he has disagreements with you and that he's going to discuss them honestly, what would you do? Would you reach out and try to mend fences? Would you double down and try to show strength? Would you look for ways to make the American administration pay for its honesty? I don't know the answer. And I suspect Netanyahu doesn't know yet either. But I do know that the dynamic has shifted. I know that the old rules don't apply. I know that the next few weeks, maybe the next few months, are going to be critical. And I know that the United States, for better or worse, is signaling a new posture, a more honest posture, a more confrontational posture.
And then there's the domestic angle. Because Vance saying this, it's not just about foreign policy. It's about domestic politics too. There's a faction of the Democratic Party, and honestly, a growing faction of the general public, that has been deeply skeptical of the Israeli government's policies. They don't like the settlement expansion. They don't like the treatment of the Palestinians. They don't like the direction that Netanyahu has taken the country. And for years, they've been told to be quiet. They've been told that criticizing Israel is politically dangerous. They've been told that you can't separate the Israeli government from the Israeli people, and that any criticism of the government is criticism of the Jewish state itself. But Vance is giving them permission. He's saying, look, even the Vice President of the United States has disagreements with the Israeli Prime Minister. And he's not afraid to say it out loud. So maybe it's not as dangerous as you thought. Maybe you can be critical of Netanyahu and still be a friend of Israel. That's a political earthquake. And Netanyahu knows it. He knows that once the dam breaks on that, the flood is going to be hard to stop. He's been relying on the American political establishment to protect him from domestic American criticism. He's been able to say, the American government supports me, so your opposition is un-American. But if the American government is openly acknowledging disagreements, that argument falls apart. So what does he do? He's got a few options. He can try to pivot, try to moderate his positions to align more closely with the Americans. But that would infuriate his far-right coalition partners. He can try to double down, lean into the conflict, and paint himself as the victim of an American betrayal. That would energize his base, but it would also isolate Israel internationally. Or he can try to wait it out, hoping that the American election produces a different vice president, a different administration, a different set of priorities. I think he's going to try all three simultaneously, because that's what Netanyahu does. He zigzags. He keeps everyone guessing. He's a survivor. He's been prime minister more than any other person in Israeli history. He knows how to ride out a storm. But this storm is different, because this isn't just a disagreement about policy. This is a disagreement about the nature of the relationship itself. And those are harder to survive. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that's really gnawing at me. Vance said he has disagreements on some issues. He didn't say which ones.
He didn't say how deep they go. He didn't say what he's willing to do about them. That ambiguity is strategic. It's also terrifying. Because as long as the disagreements are vague, everything is on the table. Military aid, diplomatic cover, intelligence sharing, the UN veto, the whole relationship is now potentially in play. And nobody knows where the line is. Vance is keeping that line intentionally fuzzy. He wants Netanyahu to wonder. He wants him to be uncertain because uncertainty creates leverage. And that's the real story here. Not that there's a disagreement. That's obvious. The real story is that the American vice president has decided that keeping the disagreement secret was no longer serving the national interest, and he chose to lay it out in public in a way that applies maximum pressure. This is the new playbook. This is the new doctrine. Protect American interests first. Be honest about disagreements. Use ambiguity strategically. And don't worry about upsetting the apple cart. I don't know where this ends. I don't know if it ends in a stronger relationship, one built on a more honest foundation, or if it ends in a fracture that takes decades to repair. What I do know is that we're at a fork in the road, and the decisions that get made in the next few weeks by Vance, by Netanyahu, by the president, by Congress, those decisions are going to shape the Middle East for the next generation. That's the weight of what just happened. That's the gravity of those few sentences in that interview. And I think we're going to look back on this moment, on this quiet Monday when Vance said something that sounded routine, and we're going to realize that it was the beginning of a very different era in American foreign policy. The question is, what comes next? And I want to be clear. I'm not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not saying Vance was right or wrong. I'm saying it happened. I'm saying it matters. And I'm saying that most people haven't grasped the magnitude of it yet. But they will. Because Netanyahu will not let this slide forever. He's going to respond. He's going to push back. He's going to make it clear that Israel is not going to be pushed around by the American vice president or anyone else. And when that response comes, it's going to escalate. It's going to become public. It's going to become a full-blown diplomatic crisis. And then the real conversation begins. Then we have to decide as a country, what is this alliance worth? What are we willing to sacrifice for it? What are we willing to demand in return? Those are hard questions. Those are questions that Americans have avoided asking for decades. But Vance has just made them unavoidable. And I think that was the point. This isn't over. This is just the beginning. We're going to keep watching this because it's going to develop fast. I'll be back when it does. Thanks for staying with me.